The location of the Garden of Eden. According to Genesis, the Garden of Eden is located in Genesis 2:10 through 2:14. And here is the passages. A river rises in Eden to water the garden. Beyond there it divides and becomes 4 branches. The name of the first is Pishon. It is the one that winds through the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is excellent. Bdellium and lapis and lazuli are also there. The name of the second river is the Gishon. It is the one that winds all through the land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It is one that flows through the east of Ashur. The fourth river is the Euphrates. In the Urantia book, the Garden of Eden was a walled-off garden to develop a new human. The garden would vanish to time as flooding and erosion would wipe it off the face of the planet. And now, directly from the Urantia book, the historical data of this fabled place. Paper 73, the Garden of Eden. The cultural decadence and spiritual poverty resulting from the Caligastia downfall and consequent social confusion had little effect on the physical or biological status of the Urantia peoples. Organic evolution proceeded apace, quite regardless of the cultural and moral setback which so swiftly followed the disaffection of Caligastia and Daligastia. And there came a time in the planetary history, almost 4,000 years ago, when the life carriers on duty took note that from a purely biological standpoint, the developmental progress of the Urantia races was nearing its apex. The Melchizedek receivers, concurring in this opinion, readily agreed to join the life carriers in a petition to the Most Highs of Edentia, asking that Urantia be inspected with a view to authorizing the dispatch of biological uplifters, a material son and daughter. This request was addressed to the Most High of Edentia because they had exercised direct jurisdiction over many of Urantia's affairs ever since Caligastia's downfall and the temporary vacation of authority on Jerusalem. Tabamantia, sovereign supervisor of the series of decimal and experimental worlds, came to inspect the planet, and after his survey of racial progress, duly recommended that Urantia be granted material sons. In little less than 100 years from the time of his inspection, Adam and Eve, a material son and daughter of the local system, arrived and began the difficult task of attempting to untangle the confused affairs of a planet retarded by rebellion and resting under the ban of spiritual isolation. The Nodites and the Adamites. On a normal planet, the arrival of the material son would ordinarily herald the approach of a great age of invention, material progress, and intellectual enlightenment. The post-Adamic era is the great scientific age of most worlds, but not so on Urantia. Though the planet was peopled by races physically fit, the tribes languished in the depths of savagery and moral stagnation. 10,000 years after the rebellion, practically all the gains of Prince's administration had been effaced. The races of the world were little better off than if this misguided son had never come to Urantia. Only among the Nodites and the Adamites was there persistence of the traditions of Dalmatia and the culture of the planetary prince. The Nodites were the descendants of the rebel members of the prince's staff, their name deriving from their first leader, Nod, one-time chairman of the Dalmatia Commission on Industry and Trade. The Adamites were the descendants of the Adonites, who chose to remain loyal with Van and Amadon. Amadonite is more of a cultural and religious designation than a racial term. Racially considered, the Amadanites were essentially Adonites. Nodite is both a cultural and racial term for the Nodites themselves. Constituted the eighth race of Urantia. There existed a traditional enmity between the Nodites and the Amadanites. This feud was constantly come to the surface whenever the offspring of these two groups would try to engage in some common enterprise. Even later in the affairs of Eden, it was exceedingly difficult for them to work together in peace. Shortly after the destruction of Dalmatia, the followers of Nod became divided into three major groups. The central group remained in the immediate vicinity of their original home near the headwaters of the Persian Gulf. The eastern group migrated to the highland regions of Elam, just east of the Euphrates Valley. The western group was situated on the northeastern Syrian shores of the Mediterranean and an adjacent territory. These Nodites had freely mated with the Sangic races and had left behind an able progeny, and some of the descendants of the rebellious Dalmatians subsequently joined Van and his loyal followers in the lands north of Mesopotamia. Here in the vicinity of Lake Van, in the southern Caspian Sea region, the Nodites mingled and mixed with the Adamites. They were numbered among the mighty men of old. Prior to the arrival of Adam and Eve, these groups, Nodites and Adonites, were the most advanced and cultural races on earth, planning for the garden. For almost 100 years, prior to Mantia's inspection, Van and his associates from their Highland headquarters of World Ethics and Culture had been preaching the advent of a promised Son of God, a racial uplifter, a teacher of truth, and the worthy successor of the traitorous Caligastia. Though the majority of the world's inhabitants of those days exhibit little or no interest in such a prediction, those who were in immediate contact with Van and Madden took such teaching seriously and began to plan for the actual reception of the promised son. Van told his nearest associates the story of the material sons in Jerusalem, what he had known of them before ever he came to Urantia. He well knew that these Adamic sons always lived in simple but charming garden homes, and proposed 83 years before the arrival of Adam and Eve, that they devoted themselves to the proclamation of their advent and to the preparation of a garden home for their reception. From their highland headquarters and from 61 far scattered settlements, Van and Madden recruited a corps of over 3,000 willing and enthusiastic workers who, in solemn assembly, dedicated themselves to the mission of preparing for the promised and least expected son. Van divided his volunteers into 100 companies, with a captain over each and an associate who served on his personal staff as a liaison officer. Keeping a Madden as his own associate, these commissions all began in earnest their preliminary work, and the committee on location for the garden sallied forth in search of the ideal spot. Although Caligastia and Delegastia had been deprived of much of their power for evil, they did everything possible to frustrate and hamper the work of preparing the garden, but their evil machinations were largely offset by the faithful activities of almost 10,000 loyal Midway creatures who so tirelessly labored to advance the enterprise. The garden site. The committee on location was absent for almost 3 years. It reported favorably concerning 3 possible locations. The first was an island in the Persian Gulf, the second the river location subsequently occupied as the second garden, the third a long narrow peninsula, almost an island projecting westward from the east shores of the Mediterranean Sea. The committee had unanimously favored the third selection. The site was chosen and 2 years were occupied in transferring the world's cultural headquarters, including the Tree of Life, to this Mediterranean peninsula. All but a single group of the peninsula dwellers peacefully vacated when Van and his company arrived. The Mediterranean peninsula had a salubrious climate and an equable temperature. This stabilized weather was due to the encircling mountains and to the fact that this area was virtually an island in an inland sea. While it rained copiously on the surrounding highlands, it seldom rained in Eden proper. But each night, from the extensive network of artificial irrigation channels, a mist would go up to refresh the vegetation of the garden. The coastline of this landmass was considerably elevated, and the neck connecting with the mainland was only 27 miles wide at narrowest point. The great river that watered down the garden came down from the higher lands of the peninsula and flowed east through the peninsular neck to the mainland, and thence across the lowlands of Mesopotamia to the sea beyond. It was fed by 4 tributaries, which took origin in the coastal hills of the Edenic Peninsula. These are the 4 heads of the river which went out of Eden, and which later became confused with the branches of the rivers surrounding the second garden. The mountains surrounding the garden abound in precious stones and metals. Though these received very little attention, the dominant idea was to be of glorification of horticulture and the exaltation of agriculture. The site chosen for the garden was probably the most beautiful spot of its kind in all the world, and the climate was then ideal. Nowhere else was there a location in which they could have lent itself so perfectly to becoming such a paradise of botanic expression. In this rendezvous, the cream of the civilization of Urantia was foregathering. Without and beyond the world lay in darkness and ignorance and savagery. Eden was the one bright spot on Urantia. It was naturally a dream of loveliness, and it soon became a poem of exquisite and perfected landscape glory, establishing the garden. When material sons, the biologic uplifters, began their sojourn on an evolutionary world, their place of abode is often called the Garden of Eden because it is characterized by the floral beauty and botanic grandeur of Edentia, the constellation capital. Van well knew of these customs and accordingly provided that the entire peninsula be given over to the garden. Pasturage and animal husbandry were projected for the adjoining mainland of animal life. Only the birds and various domesticated species were to be found in the park. Van's instructions were that Eden was to be a garden, and only a garden. No animals were ever slaughtered within its precincts. All flesh eaten by the garden workers throughout all the years of construction was brought in from the herds maintained under guard on the mainland. The first task was the building of the brick wall across the neck of the peninsula. This once completed, the real work of landscape beautification and home building could proceed unhindered. A zoological garden was created by building a smaller wall just outside the main wall. The intervening space, occupied by all manner of wild beasts, served as an additional defense against hostile attacks. This menagerie was organized in 12 grand divisions. The walled paths led between these groups to the 12 gates of the Eden. The river and its adjacent pastures occupying the central area. In the preparation of the garden, only volunteer laborers were employed. No hirelings were ever used. They cultivated the garden and tended their herds for support. Contributions of food were also received from nearby believers. This great enterprise was carried through to completion in spite of the difficulties attendant upon the confused status of the world during these troublous times. But it was a cause of great disappointment when Van, not knowing how soon the expected son and daughter might come, suggested that the younger generation also be trained in the work of carrying on the enterprise in case their arrival should be delayed. This seemed like an admission of lack of faith on Van's part, and made considerable trouble because many desertions, but Van went forward with his plan of preparedness, meantime filling the places of the deserters with younger volunteers. The Garden Home. At the center of the Edenic Peninsula was the exquisite stone temple of the Universal Father, the sacred shrine of the garden. To the north, the administrative headquarters was established. To the south were built the homes for the workers and their families. To the west was provided by the allotment of ground for the proposed schools of the educational system of the expected son, while in the east of Eden were built the domiciles intended for the promised son and his immediate offspring. The architectural plans for Eden provided homes and abundant land for 1 million human beings. At the time of Adam's arrival, though, the garden was only 1/4 finished. It had thousands of miles of irrigation ditches and more than 12,000 miles of paved paths and roads. They were a trifle over 5,000 brick buildings in the various sectors, and the trees and plants were almost beyond number. 7 was the largest number of houses composing any one cluster in the park, and though the structures of the garden were simple, they were most artistic. The roads and paths were well built, and the landscapes were exquisite. The sanitary arrangements of the garden were far in advance of anything that had been attempted therefore on Urantia. The drinking water of Eden was kept wholesome by the strict observance of sanitary regulations designed to conserve its purity. During these early times, much trouble came about from neglect of these rules, but Van gradually impressed upon his associates the importance of allowing nothing to fall into the water supply of the garden. Before the later establishment of a sewage disposal system, Edenites practiced the scrupulous burial of all waste or decomposing material. Maidens inspectors made their rounds each day in search for possible causes of sickness. Urantians did not again awaken to the importance of the prevention of human diseases till later times of the 19th and 20th centuries. Before the disruption of the Adamic regime, a covered brick conduit disposal system had been constructed, which ran beneath the walls and emptied into the river of Eden, almost a mile beyond the outer and lesser wall of the garden. By the time of Adam's arrival, most of the plants of that section of the world were growing in Eden. Already had many of the fruits, cereals, and nuts that were greatly improved. Many modern vegetables and cereals were first cultivated here, but scores of varieties of food plants were subsequently lost to the world. Almost 5% of the garden was under high artificial cultivation, 15% partially cultivated, the remainder being left in a more or less natural state pending the arrival of Adam, it being thought best to finish the park in accordance with his ideas. And so was the Garden of Eden was ready for the reception of the promised Adam and his consort. And this garden would have done honor to a world under perfected administration and normal control. Adam and Eve were well pleased with the general plan of Eden, though they made many changes in the furnishings of their own personal dwelling. Although the work of embellishment was hardly finished at the time of Adam's arrival, the place was already a gem of botanic beauty, and during the early days of his sojourn in Eden, the whole garden took on new form and assumed new proportions of beauty and grandeur. Never before has this time nor after has Urantia harbored such a beautiful and repleted exhibition of horticulture and agriculture. The Tree of Life. In the center of the garden temple, Van planted the long-guarded Tree of Life, whose leaves were for healing of the nations, and whose fruit had so long sustained him on earth. Van well knew that Adam and Eve would be dependent on this gift of Edentia for their life maintenance after they once appeared on Urantia in material form. The material suns on the system capitals do not require the tree of life for sustenance. Only in the planetary repersonalization are they dependent on the adjunct to physical immortality. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil may be a figure of speech, a symbolic designation, covering a multitude of human experiences, but the tree of life was not a myth. It was a real, and for a long time was present on Urantia. When the Most High of Udentia approved the commission of Caligastia as planetary prince of Urantia, and those of the 100 Jerusalem citizens as his administrative staff, they sent to the planet by the Melchizedeks a shrub of Udentia, and this plant grew to be the tree of life on Urantia. This form of non-intelligent life is native to the constellation headquarters spheres, being also found on the headquarters worlds of local and superuniverses, as well as on the Havona spheres, but not on the system capitals. This superplant stored up certain space energies that were antidotal to the age-producing elements of animal existence. The fruit of the tree of life was like a superchemical storage battery, mysteriously releasing the life extension force of the universe when eaten. The form of sustenance was wholly useless to the ordinary evolutionary beings on Urantia, but specifically it was serviceable to the 100 materialized members of Caligastia's staff and to the 100 modified Adonites who had contributed to the life plasm to the prince's staff, and who in return were made possessors of that complement of life, which made it possible for them to utilize the fruit of the tree of life for an indefinite extension of their otherwise mortal existence. During the days of the prince's rule, the tree was growing from the earth in the central and circular courtyard of the father's temple. Upon the outbreak of the rebellion, it was regrown from the central core by Van and his associates in their temporary camp. The Edentia shrub was subsequently taken to their highland retreat, where it served both Van and Amadon for more than 150,000 years. When Van and his associates made ready the garden for Adam and Eve, they transplanted the Edentia tree to the Garden of Eden, where once again it grew in a central circular courtyard of another temple to the Father, and Adam and Eve periodically partook of its fruit for the maintenance of their dual form of physical life. When the plans of the material sun went astray, Adam and his family were not permitted to carry the core of the tree away from the garden. When the Nodites invaded Eden, they were told they would become as gods if they partook of the fruit of the tree. Much to their surprise, they found it unguarded. They ate freely of the fruit for years, but it did nothing for them. They were all material mortals of the realm. They lacked that endowment which acted as a complement to the fruit of the tree. They became enraged at their inability to benefit from the tree of life, and in connection with one of their internal wars, the temple and tree were both destroyed by fire. Only the stone wall stood until the garden was subsequently submerged. This was the second temple of the Father to perish. And now must all flesh on Urantia take the natural course of life and death. Adam and Eve, their children, and their children's children, together with their associates, all perished in the course of time, thus become subject to ascension scheme of the local universe, wherein mansion world resurrection follows material death. After the first garden was vacated by Adam, the fate of Eden. After the first garden was vacated by Adam, it was occupied variously by the Nodites, Kutites, and the Suntites. It later became the dwelling place of the northern Nodites, who opposed cooperation with the Adamites. The peninsula had been overrun by these lower-grade Nodites for almost 4,000 years. After Adam left the garden, when in connection with the violent activity of the surrounding volcanoes and the submergence of the Sicilian land bridge to Africa, the eastern floor of the Mediterranean Sea sank, carrying down beneath the waters the whole of the Edenic peninsula. concomitant with this vast submergence. The coastline of the eastern Mediterranean was greatly elevated, and this was the end of the most beautiful natural creation that Urantia has ever harbored. The sinking was not sudden, several hundred years being required completely to submerge the entire peninsula. We cannot regard this disappearance of the garden as being in any way a result of the miscarriage of the divine plans or as a result of the mistakes of Adam and Eve. We do not regard the submergence of Eden as anything but a natural occurrence. But it does seem to us that the sink in the garden was timed to occur just about the date of the accumulation of the reserves of the violet race for undertaking the work of rehabilitating the world peoples. The Melchizedeks counseled Adam not to initiate the program of racial uplift and blending until his own family had numbered 500,000. It was never intended that the garden should be the permanent home of the Adamites. They were to become missionaries of a new life to all the world. They were to mobilize for unselfish bestowal upon the needy races of earth. The instruction given Adam by the Melchizedeks implied that he was to establish racial, continental, and divisional headquarters to be in charge of his immediate sons and daughters, while he and Adam and Eve were to divide their time among these various world capitals as advisors and coordinators of the worldwide ministry of biological uplift, intellectual advancement, and moral rehabilitation. Fascinatingly, this was a story about the first Eden. The Urantia book describes a saga about the second Eden, which would be the last Eden on this planet. Paper 76. The Second Garden. When Adam elected to leave the first garden to the Nodites unopposed, he and his followers could not go west, for the Edenites had no boats suitable for such a marine venture. They could not go north. The northern Nodites were already on the march towards Eden. They feared to go south. The hills of that region were infested with hostile tribes. The only way open was to the east. So they journeyed eastward toward the pleasant regions between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Many of those who were left behind later journeyed eastward to join the Adamites in their new valley home. Cain and Sansa were both born before the Adamic caravan had reached its destination between the rivers in Mesopotamia. Leota, the mother of Sansa, perished at the birth of her daughter. Eve suffered much but survived. Owing to superior strength, Eve took Sansa, the child Leota, to her bosom, and she was reared along with Cain. Sansa grew up to be a woman of great ability. She became the wife of Sargon, the chief of the northern blue races, and contributed to the advancement of the blue men of those times. The Edenites entered Mesopotamia. It required almost a full year for the caravan of Adam to reach the Euphrates River. Finding it in flood tide, they remained camped on the plains west of the stream, almost 6 weeks before they made their way across the land between the rivers, which was to become the second garden. When word had reached the dwellers in the land of the second garden that the king and high priest of the Garden of Eden was marching on them, they had fled in haste to the eastern mountains. Adam found all the desired territory vacated when he arrived, and here in this new location, Adam and his helpers set themselves to work to build new homes and establish a new center of culture and religion. This site was known to Adam as one of the 3 original selections of the committee assigned to choose possible locations for the garden, proposed by Van and Amadan. The 2 rivers themselves were a good natural defense in those days, and a short way north of the second garden, the Euphrates and Tigris came close together so that a defense wall extending 56 miles could be built for the protection of the territory to the south and between the rivers. After getting settled in the new Eden, it became necessary to adopt crude methods of living. It seemed entirely true that the ground had been cursed. Nature had once again taken its course. Now were the Adamites compelled. To wrest a living from the unprepared soil and to cope with the realities of life in the face of the natural hostilities and incompatibilities of mortal existence, they found the first garden partially prepared for them, but the second had to be created by the labor of their own hands in the sweat of their faces. Cain and Abel. Less than 2 years after Cain's birth, Abel was born, the first child of Adam and Eve to be born in the second garden. When Abel grew up to the age of 12 years, he elected to be a herder. Cain had chosen to follow agriculture. Now in those days it was customary to make offerings to the priesthood of the things at hand. Herders would bring of their flocks, farmers of the fruits of the fields, and in accordance with this custom, Cain and Abel likewise made periodic offerings to the priests. The two boys had many times argued about the relative merits of their vocations, and Abel was not slow to note the preference was shown for his animal sacrifices. In vain did Cain appeal to the traditions of the first Eden, to the former preferences for the fruits of the fields, but this Abel would not allow, and he taunted his older brother in his discomfiture. In the days of the first Eden, Adam indeed sought to discourage the offering of animal sacrifice, so that Cain had a justifiable precedent for his contentions. It was, however, difficult to organize the religious life of the second Eden. Adam was burdened with 1,001 details associated with the work of building, defense, and agriculture. Being much depressed spiritually, he entrusted the organization of worship and education of those of Nodite extraction, who had served in these capacities in the first garden. And in even so short a time, the officiating Nodite priests were reverting to the standards and rulings of pre-Adamic times. The two boys never got along well, and this matter of sacrifices further contributed to the growing hatred between them. Abel knew he was the son of both Adam and Eve, and never failed to impress upon Cain that Adam was not his father. Cain was not pure violet, as his father was of the Nodite race, later admixed with blue and the red man, with the aboriginal Adonite stock. And all of this, with Cain's natural bellicose inheritance, caused him to nourish an ever-increasing hatred for his younger brother. The boys were respectively 18 and 20 years of age when the tension between them was finally resolved one day, when Abel's taunts so infuriated his bellicose brother that Cain turned upon him in wrath and slew him. The observation of Abel's conduct establishes the value of environmental and education as factors in character development. Abel had an ideal inheritance, and hereditary lies at the bottom of all character, but the influence of an inferior environment virtually neutralized the magnificent inheritance. Abel, especially during his younger years, was greatly influenced by his unfavorable surroundings. He would have become an entirely different person had he lived to be 25 or 30. His superb inheritance would have shown itself. While a good environment cannot contribute much towards really overcoming the character handicaps of a base heredity, a bad environment can effectively spoil an excellent inheritance, at least during the younger years of life. Good social environment and proper education are indispensable soil and atmosphere for getting the most out of a good inheritance. The death of Abel became known to his parents when his dogs brought the flocks home without their master. To Adam and Eve, Cain was fast becoming the grim reminder of their folly. They encouraged him in his decision to leave the garden. Cain's life in Mesopotamia had not been exactly happy, since he was in such a peculiar way symbolic of the default. It was not that his associates were unkind to him, but he had not been unaware of their subconscious resentment of his presence. But Cain knew that, since he bore no tribal mark, he would be killed by the first neighboring tribesmen who might chance to meet him. Fear and some remorse led him to repent. Cain had never been indwelt by an adjuster, had always been defiant to the family discipline and disdainful of his father's religion. But he now went to Eve, his mother and asked for spiritual help and guidance. When he honestly sought divine assistance, an adjuster indwelt him, and this adjuster dwelling within and looking out gave Cain a distinct advantage of superiority, which classed him with the greatly feared tribe of Adam. And so Cain departed for the land of Nod, east of the second Eden. He became a great leader among one of the group of his father's people, and did to a certain degree fulfill the predictions of Saraptatia, for he did promote peace between the division of the Nodites and the Adamites. Throughout his lifetime, Cain married Ramona, his distant cousin and their first son. Enoch became the head of Elamite, Nodites, and for hundreds of years the Elamites and the Adamites continued to be at peace. Life in the Mesopotamia. As life passed in the second garden, the consequences of default became increasingly apparent. Adam and Eve greatly missed their former home of beauty and tranquility, as well as their children who had been deported to Edantia. It was indeed pathetic to observe that the magnificent couple reduced to the status of common flesh of the realm, but they bore their diminished estate with grace and fortitude. Adam wisely spent most of his time training his children with their associates in civil administration, educational methods, and religious devotions. Had it not been for his foresight, and pandemonium would have broken loose upon his death. As it was, the death of Adam made little difference in the conduct of the affairs of his people. But long before Adam and Eve passed away, they recognized that their children and followers had gradually learned to forget the days of their glory in Eden, and it was better for the majority of their followers that they did forget the grandeur of Eden. They were not so likely to experience undue dissatisfaction with the less unfortunate environment. The civil rulers of Adamites were derived hereditarily from the sons of the first garden. Adam's first son, Abson, Adam ben Adam, founded a secondary career of the violet race of the north, of the second Eden. Adam's second son, Everson, became a masterly leader and administrator. He was the great helper of his father. Everson lived not quite so long as Adam, and his eldest son, Jansud, became the successor of Adam as the head of the Adamite tribes. The religious rulers or priesthood originated with Seth, the eldest surviving son of Adam and Eve, born in the second garden. He was born 129 years after Adam's arrival on Urantia. Seth became absorbed in the work of improving the spiritual status of his father's people. Becoming the head of the new priesthood of the second garden, his son Enos founded the new order of worship, and his grandson Kenan instituted the foreign missionary service to the surrounding tribes, near and far. The Sethite priesthood was a threefold undertaking embracing religion, health, and education. The priests of this order were trained to officiate at religious ceremonies, to serve as physicians and sanitary inspectors, and to act as teachers in the schools of the garden. Adam's caravan had carried the seeds and bulbs of hundreds of plants and cereals of the first garden with them to the land between the rivers. They also had brought along extensive herds, and some of them all the domesticated animals. Because of this, they possessed great advantages over the surrounding tribes. They enjoyed many of the benefits of the previous culture of the original garden. Up to the time of leaving the first garden, Adam and his family had always subsisted on fruit, cereals, and nuts. On the way to Mesopotamia, they had for the first time partaken of herbs and vegetables. The eating of meat was early introduced into the second garden, but Adam and Eve never partook of flesh as a part of their regular diet. Neither did Adamson, nor Everson, nor the other children of the first generation of the first garden become flesh-eaters. Adamites greatly excelled the surrounding peoples in the cultural achievement and intellectual development. They produced the third alphabet, and otherwise laid the foundations for much what was the forerunner of modern art, science, and literature. Here in the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, they maintained the arts of writing, metalworking, pottery making, and weaving, and produced a type of architecture that that was not excelled in thousands of years. The home life of the violet people was for their day and age ideal. Children were subjected to courses of training in agriculture, craftsmanship, and animal husbandry, or else they were educated to perform the threefold duty of Sephite, to be priest, physician, and teacher. And when thinking of the Sephite priesthood, do not confuse those high-minded and noble teachers of health and religion. Those true educators with the debased and commercial priesthoods of the later tribes and surrounding nations. Their religious concepts of deity and the universe were advanced and more or less accurate, with health provisions, were for their time excellent, and their methods of education have never since been surpassed. The Violet Race. Adam and Eve were the founders of the Violet Race of men, the ninth human race to appear on Urantia. Adam and his offspring had blue eyes, and the Violet people were characterized with fair complexions and light hair color yellow, red, and brown. Eve did not suffer pain in childbirth. Neither did the early evolutionary races. Only the mixed races produced by the union of evolutionary man with the Nodites. Later with the Adamites suffered the severe pangs of childbirth. Adam and Eve, like their brethren on Jerusalem, were energized by dual nutrition, subsistent of both food and light, supplemented by certain superphysical energies unrevealed on Urantia. Their Urantia offspring did not inherit parental endowment of energy intake and light circulation. They had a single circulation. The human type of blood sustenance. They were designingly mortal through long-lived, albeit longevity gravitated towards the human norm with each succeeding generation. Adam and Eve and their first generation of children did not use the flesh of animals for food. They subsisted wholly upon the fruits of the trees. After the first generation of the descendants of Adam began to partake of dairy products, but many of them continued to follow a non-flesh diet. Many of the southern tribes with whom they later united were also non-flesh eaters. Later on, most of these vegetarian tribes migrated to the east and survived as now admixed in the peoples of India. Both the physical and spiritual visions of Adam and Eve were far superior to those of the present day peoples. Their special senses were much more acute, and they were able to see the midwares and the angelic hosts. The Melchizedeks and the fallen prince Caligastia, who several times came to confer with his noble successor, they retained the ability to see these celestial beings for over 100 years after the default. These special senses were not so acutely present in their children and tended to diminish with each succeeding generation. The Adamic children were usually adjuster indwelt. Since they all possessed undoubted survival capacity, these superior offspring were not so subject to fear as the children of evolution. So much of fear persists in the present-day races of Urantia because your ancestors received so little of Adam's life plasm. Owing to the early miscarriage of the plans for racial physical uplift, the body cells of the material sons and their progeny are far more resistant to disease than those of the evolutionary beings indigenous to the planet. The body cells of the native races are akin to the living disease-producing microscopic and ultramicroscopic organisms of the realm. These facts explain why the Urantia peoples must do so much by the way of scientific effort to withstand so many physical disorders. You would be far more disease-resistant if your races carry more of the Adamic life. After becoming established in the second garden on the Euphrates, Adam elected to leave behind as much of his life plasm as possible to benefit the world after his death. Accordingly, Eve was made head of the commission of 12 on race improvement, and before Adam died, this commission had selected 1,682 the highest type of women on Urantia, and these women were pregnant with the Adamic life plasm. Their children all grew up to maturity except 112. so that the world in this way was benefited by the addition of 1,570 superior men and women. Though these candidate mothers were selected from all the surrounding tribes and represented most of the races on Earth, the majority were chosen from the highest strains of the Nodites, and they constituted the early beginnings of the mighty Andite race. These children were born and reared in the tribal surroundings of their respective mothers. Death of Adam and Eve. Not long after the establishment of the second Eden, Adam and Eve were duly informed that their repentance was acceptable and that while they were doomed to suffer the fate of mortals of their world, they should certainly become eligible for admission to the ranks of the sleeping survivors of Urantia. They fully believed this gospel of resurrection and rehabilitation, which the Melchizedeks so touchingly proclaimed to them. Their transgression had been an error of judgment, and not the sin of conscious and deliberate rebellion. Adam and Eve did not, as citizens of Jerusalem, have fought justers, nor were they adjusters indwelt. When they functioned on Urantia in the first garden, but shortly after their reduction to mortal status, they became conscious of a new presence within them, and they awakened to the realization that human status, coupled with sincere repentance, had made it possible for adjusters to indwell them. It was this knowledge of being adjuster indwelt that greatly hardened Adam and Eve throughout the remainder of their lives. They knew they had failed as material sons of Satania, but they also knew that the paradise career was still open to them as sending sons of the universe. Adam knew about the dispensational resurrection which occurred simultaneously with his arrival on the planet. He believed that he and his companions would probably be repersonalized in connection with the advent and next order of sonship. He did not know that Michael, the sovereign of the universe, was so soon to appear on Urantia. He expected that the next son would be on the Avono order. Even so, it was always a comfort to Adam and Eve, as well as something difficult for them to understand, to ponder the only personal message they ever received from Michael. This message, amongst other expressions of friendship and comfort, said, "I have given consideration to the circumstances of your default. I have remembered the desire of your hearts, ever to be loyal to my Father's will, and you will be called from the embrace of mortal slumber when I come to Urantia. If the subordinate sons of my realm do not send for you before that time." And this was a great mystery to Adam and Eve. They could comprehend the veiled promise of a possible special resurrection in this message, and such a possibility greatly cheered them, but they could not grasp the meaning of the intimation that they might rest until the time of resurrection associated with Michael's personal appearance on Urantia. And so the Edenic pair always proclaimed that a son of God would sometime come, and they communicated to their loved ones the belief, at least, the longing hope, that the world of their blunders and sorrows might possibly be the realm where the rulers of this universe would elect to function as the paradise bestowal son. It seemed too good to be true, but Adam did entertain the thought that the strife-torn Urantia might, after all, turn out to be the most fortunate world in the system of Satania, and the envied planet of all Nabadan. Adam lived to 530 years. He died of what might be termed old age. His physical mechanism simply wore out. The process of disintegration gradually gained on the process of repair, and the inevitable end came. Eve had died 19 years previously of a weakened heart. They were both buried in the center of the temple of divine service, which had been built in accordance with their plans soon after the wall of the colony had been completed. And this was the origin of the practice of burying noted and pious men and women under the floors of places of worship. The supermaterial government of Urantia under the direction of the Melchizedeks continued, but direct physical contact with the evolutionary races had been severed. From the distant days of the arrival of the corporeal staff and the planetary prince down through the times of Van and Maiden to the arrival of Adam and Eve, physical representations of the universe government had been stationed on the planet. But with the Adamic default, this region extended over a period of more than 450,000 years came to an end. In the spiritual spheres, the angelic helpers continued to struggle in conjunction with the thought adjusters, both working heroically for the salvage of the individual. But no comprehensive plan for far-reaching world welfare was promulgated to the mortals of earth until the arrival of Macaventa Melchizedek in the times of Abraham, who with the power of patience and authority of the Son of God did lay the foundations for the further uplift and spiritual rehabilitation of unfortunate Urantia. Misfortune was not, however, been the sole lot of Urantia. The planet had been the most fortunate in the local universe of Nebaden. Urantians should count it all gain if the blunders of their ancestors and the mistakes of the early world rulers so plunged the planet into a hopeless state of confusion, all the more confounded by evil and sin. And this very background of darkness would so appeal to Michael Nebaden that he selected this world as the arena wherein to reveal the loving personality of the Father in heaven. It is not that Urantia needed a creator's son to set its tangled affairs in order. It is rather that the evil and sin of Urantia afforded the creator's son a more striking background against which to reveal the matchless love, mercy, and patience of Paradise Father. Survival of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve went to their mortal rest with strong faith in the promises made by them by the Melchizedeks, that they would sometime awaken from the sleep of death to resume life on the mansion worlds also familiar to them in the days preceding to their mission and the material flesh of the violet race on Urantia. They did not long rest in the oblivion of the unconscious sleep of the mortals of the realm. On the third day after Adam's death, the second following his reverent burial, the orders of Lana Forge sustained that the acting Most High of Adentia concurred in by the union of days on Salvington. Acting for Michael were placed in Gabriel's hands, directing the special roll call of the distinguished survivors of the Adamic default on Urantia. And in accordance with this mandate of special resurrection, number 26 of the Urantia series, Adam and Eve were repersonalized, reassembled in the resurrection halls in the mansion worlds of Satania, together with 1,316 of their associates in the experience of the first garden. Many other loyal souls had been translated at that time of Adam's arrival, which was attended by the dispensational adjudication of both the sleeping survivors and the living qualified ascenders. Adam and Eve quickly passed through the world's progressive ascension until they attained citizenship on Jerusalem, once again to be residents of the planet of their origin, but this time as members of a different order of universe personalities. They left Jerusalem as permanent citizens, sons of God. They returned as ascended citizens, sons of man. They were immediately attached to the Urantia services on the system capital, later being assigned membership. Among the 4 and 20 counselors that which constitute the present advisory control body of Urantia, and thus ends the story of planetary Adam and Eve on Urantia, a story of trial, tragedy, and triumph, at least personal triumph for your well-meaning but deluded material son and daughter, and undoubtedly in the end a story of ultimate triumph for their world, and its rebellion-tossed and evil-harassed inhabitants. When all is summed up, Adam and Eve made a mighty contribution to the speedy civilization and accelerated biological progress of the human race. They left a great culture on Earth, but it was not possible for such an advanced civilization to survive in the face of the early dilution and eventual submergence of the Adamic inheritance. It is the people who make a civilization. Civilization does not make the people. The Lost Book of Enki is also an excellent place to find a Sumerian backup story to the Garden of Eden. The garden was a lab setting for the first true workers for the Anunnaki.